They told you history is a record of progress, that civilization marches forward, guided by justice, law, and order. But what if that was only the mask, and behind it there was only hunger, blood, and power? Tonight, I'm going to show you a story that was never meant to reach your ears. A story that begins in the Ozarks, in 1866. A story so dark that even the whispers of it carried fear. It begins not with justice, not with lawmen, not even with murder. It begins with a ledger, a simple book. But inside that ledger were names that never came home. In the autumn of 1867, federal investigators pried open the floorboards of a trading post along a forgotten trail. What they found beneath wasn't gold, wasn't treasure, but a hidden archive of human lives erased, over 300 travelers, each one catalogued with military precision, their names, their wealth, their roots, and next to those entries, a single chilling word repeated again and again: none. Expected return: none. Stop for a moment and let that sink in. These weren't bandits killing for food, desperate men robbing at gunpoint. This was something more organized, more deliberate, a quiet machine that fed on travelers the way a spider feeds on flies. And the men who ran it, not faceless shadows, not nameless killers in the woods, but respected members of the community. Brothers, Irish immigrants, war veterans, men who shook hands at church on Sunday, then marked your name for death on Monday. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic extraction, a hidden economy built on human disappearance. And the terrifying part, everyone suspected, but no one spoke, because in the Missouri Ozarks of 1866, the line between lawman and outlaw was thin as smoke, and most often they were the same man. Before we descend deeper into this rabbit hole, tell me, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your stole to your city in the comments below, because as you listen to what I'm about to tell you, you'll start to see echoes of it in your own town, your own country, your own institutions. Different century, same hunger, same shadows. The Sullivan brothers, Patrick and Shah, names that should have been forgotten, names that should have been buried in the dirt with the bones of the men they erased, and yet, here they are again. Two men who turned hospitality into a weapon, who turned water into poison, who turned a trading post into the deadliest trap in the post-Civil War frontier. History books will never give them a chapter. Their story is too raw, too close to truths that still bleed into the present. But tonight, I will give you what the official record refused to: the descent. How it began, how it spread, and how it still echoes in every system of control that tells you who to trust. This is not just a story about Missouri in 1866. This is a mirror. And once you look into it, once you see the reflection, you can't unsee it. So lean closer, because from here on, every word drags you deeper, and every revelation is a step you cannot step back from. The Missouri Ozarks in the 1860s were not the postcard hills of today. They were wild, raw, and untamed, a jagged wilderness where law was not written on paper but carved in the memory of who had the most guns, who commanded the most fear, and who could silence the most voices. It was the perfect place for predators to hide, because every man already carried suspicion in his eyes. The Civil War had ended, but its scars bled through every ridge and valley. Former Confederate guerrillas, men who had once struck from the shadows in the name of rebellion, now lived as bandits in the brush. Union deserters drifted through the forests like hungry ghosts, looking for anyone weaker than them to devour. Federal authority was a rumor here, its presence flickering like a candle in a storm, seen only when troops passed through, and gone the moment they vanished over the horizon. It was into this broken landscape that the Sullivan brothers walked in the spring of 1864, two Irishmen from County Cork who had already tasted the bitter iron of war. Patrick, the elder at 32, had a tongue like silver and a mind sharpened not by books, but by survival. He knew how to listen, how to mirror the man across from him, how to make secrets spill as easily as whiskey from a bottle. His younger brother Shah, broader, harder, scarred by combat, was the shadow to Patrick's charm. Where Patrick opened doors with words, Shah kept them closed with menace. Together they were the perfect coin, one face that smiled, one face that glared. They built their trading post at a crossroads the locals called Hellhound Crossing. It wasn't a name you'd find on a map, but every traveler knew it. It was where the main road between Joplin and Springfield met the Devil's Backbone Trail, a shorter, riskier path through the Ozark heartland. The choice for travelers was simple. Take the long road patrolled by occasional lawmen or shave days off your journey through land where trees whispered and men vanished. The Sullivan brothers offered weary travelers what appeared to be refuge. A log building with a false front, stocked with basic goods, flour, salt, gunpowder, cheap whiskey, a place where a man could sit at a rough-hewn table, take a drink, and hear advice from locals who seemed to know every bend of the trail. Patrick's voice would lower, soft and confidential, as if he were sharing something no one else could be trusted with. Shah would stand nearby, silent, his presence a reminder that refusing the advice wasn't wise. It wasn't just a store. It was a theater, every gesture rehearsed, every map drawn to lead a man not toward safety, but toward disappearance. Yet in those early years, no one suspected. Why would they? The brothers were polite. They were generous. They were war veterans who carried themselves like men who had already paid their dues. They smiled at children. They donated supplies to struggling farmers. They poured drinks for the sheriff himself. That was their genius. They understood that the most effective predators wear the skin of protectors. The Sullivan Post became more than a stop for goods. It became the hub of gossip, of trust, of whispered secrets. Men traveling through with pockets heavy from California gold would lower their guard, believing they had found friends, and in a way, they had. Friends who knew the fastest way to separate them from their wealth, their freedom, their breath. But not everyone was blind. Some locals began to notice that travelers who stopped at the Sullivan's place never seemed to arrive at their destinations. Wives waited for husbands who never came home. Brothers searched for brothers who vanished like mist. Still, no one dared accuse the Sullivans, because in a land where law was fragile and corruption ran, deep suspicion could get you killed as easily as the trail itself. And so the silence grew. A silence as thick as the forests that surrounded Hellhound Crossing, a silence that let the brothers build their empire in plain sight. But cracks were already forming. Because in October of 1864, a farmer's wife named Martha Hensley carried a basket of eggs to the back door of the trading post, and what she overheard that night would chill her blood and confirm the whispers that had already begun. The evening was crisp, the kind of October night when the smoke of wood fires lingers low and the air tastes of dying leaves. Martha Hensley, a farmer's wife with hands roughened by years of work, walked toward the Sullivan trading post with a basket of eggs on her hip. She had made this trip dozens of times before, a simple barter, fresh eggs for salt, sugar, maybe a bit of lamp oil. The trail was dark but familiar, and the glow of lamplight seeping through the log walls of the post promised warmth and company. She never delivered those eggs. As she reached the back of the building, her hand lifted to knock. But voices cut through the rough timbers. She froze, ears straining. Patrick's Irish lilt rolled through the walls, smooth as honey, but carrying something colder underneath. He wasn't speaking to a customer about flour or whiskey. No, the words were heavier, sharper, like the edge of a knife pressed just behind a smile. "The German fellow," a man's voice muttered, one she didn't recognize. "Left here 3 days ago with enough gold to buy half of Springfield. Took the Devil's Backbone like you suggested. Should have reached the main road by now. But no one's seen him." Martha's stomach dropped. She pressed closer to the wall, her breath fogging in the chill air. Patrick answered, casual, almost amused. "That trail can be treacherous, especially for a man traveling alone. Wild country, that is. Anything could happen to him out there. Animals, bandits, accidents. Who's to say?" The stranger wasn't convinced. "It's the timing. Too convenient. Every time you send someone that way..." A heavier voice cut him off. Shah's voice, deep, menacing, the kind of tone that leaves bruises even when no blow is struck. "You questioning our judgment, friend? Because if you are, maybe you'd like to carry those doubts to Sheriff Dalton. I'm sure he'd love to hear about your suspicious. Martha's hand dropped from the door. She stepped back into the shadows, heart hammering. The silence on the other side of the wall stretched long and taut. Finally, the stranger's voice returned, broken, submissive. No need for that. Just seems like bad luck on that trail lately. Patrick chuckled, the sound light but hollow. Bad luck follows some men like a faithful dog. Now, about that payment we discussed. Martha turned and fled, clutching the basket tight to her chest, though the eggs inside cracked and oozed with each jolt of her hurried steps. She didn't stop until her farmhouse came into view, her husband's lantern swinging on the porch. When he asked why she was pale, why her basket was ruined, she lied. Said she had tripped on the trail. Said nothing about the voices, nothing about what she had heard. Because what could she say? Sheriff Dalton drank whiskey with Patrick Sullivan at the very table where she had nearly knocked. The federal marshals rarely ventured into those hills, and even when they did, they were strangers. Men who couldn't tell one Irishman from another, one disappearance from the hundreds that haunted the post-war frontier. To speak aloud what she suspected would not only risk her own life but brand her as hysterical, untrustworthy. So Martha did what so many did in that time and place. She kept the secret. She carried it like a stone in her chest, heavy, unyielding, but her silence condemned more than her conscience. Within 2 weeks, 3 more men vanished along the Devil's Backbone Trail, 3 names that would never return home. And Martha, she lived with the knowledge that she had heard the gears of the machine grinding. She had heard death being discussed like business, but by choosing silence, she had become a thread in the conspiracy herself. This is how control works. Not always with chains or guns, but wow bo bem bang, with fear, doubt, and silence. The Sullivan brothers understood it perfectly. If people fear speaking more than they fear murder, then murder becomes invisible. And invisible murder is the most profitable kind of all. The Ozarks were already whispering, but whispers aren't enough to break a machine. Not yet. By the winter of 1864, the whispers had become more than rumor. Too many men were leaving the Sullivan trading post full of optimism, full of whiskey, and never arriving at the places they promised their families they'd be. And in the small towns scattered along the Missouri trails, people began to notice a pattern they couldn't quite name aloud. It was always the same kind of man. Prospectors on their way home from California, their pockets heavy with dust and nuggets, the shine of hard-earned gold hidden in saddlebags. Men traveling alone or with one companion, men tired, worn from years of mining camps and lonely trails. They would stop at Hellhound Crossing, sit at the Sullivans' tables, and leave with maps carefully drawn by Patrick's own hand. Then they would vanish into the trees of the Devil's Backbone, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. At first, the explanations were easy. This was outlaw country. Confederate holdouts roamed the woods, veterans who had never laid down their guns. Wolves prowled. The trails were treacherous, full of gorges and river crossings that could kill the unwary. A man alone was always a man at risk. People wanted to believe that, needed to believe that, because the alternative was unthinkable. But the disappearances kept multiplying. By December, the name Sullivan hung unspoken at the edges of every fearful conversation. Men drank their whiskey in Springfield boarding houses and muttered about the bad luck around Hellhound Crossing. Women at Sunday gatherings whispered about neighbors who never came home. The fear was real. And yet, nothing was done. Because fear alone is not enough to crack corruption. Sheriff Thomas Dalton, the man charged with protecting the county, was one of Patrick Sullivan's closest drinking partners. Dalton publicly blamed the chaos of the post-war years. A man traveling with gold is a fool. Bandits will find him sooner or later, he would declare at town meetings, his voice carrying authority that no one dared challenge. Privately, though, he trusted Patrick more than most of the men in his own ranks. Why wouldn't he? Patrick fed him information, gave him tips about real criminals, and helped him stage arrests that made Dalton look like a man in control. And here is the genius of the scheme. The Sullivans didn't simply kill, they integrated themselves into the system. They provided lawmen with victories. They turned themselves into indispensable allies. Patrick knew every outlaw rumor within 50 miles because his customers gave him that intelligence freely over mugs of whiskey. He could pass along just enough truth to the sheriff to keep suspicion away, while Shah's looming presence ensured no one else dared to ask questions. When Frederick Steinbeck, a boarding house owner in Springfield, began to search for his missing brother-in-law, he traced the trail right back to Hellhound Crossing. He went there once, twice, 3 times. Each time, Patrick welcomed him warmly, pulled out the same maps, and recited the same story. The missing man had insisted on taking the shortcut, despite their warnings. Patrick's tone dripped with concern. Shah stood silently, arms crossed, daring him to accuse them of anything else. Frederick left confused, angry, but powerless. When he finally went to Sheriff Dalton with his suspicions, the sheriff shut him down hard. "The Sullivan brothers have done more for law and order than any man in this county," Dalton told him. "Stop harassing honest businessmen with wild theories." That was the end of it. Frederick walked out of that office knowing the truth. The law was never going to protect him. It was part of the same web. This is how darkness thrives. It doesn't hide in caves or wear masks. It stands in plain sight, offering you a drink, shaking your hand, smiling with clean teeth while the ledger under the floorboards fills with names that will never return. By the spring of 1865, the Sullivans weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Their post had become a hub of power, a spider's web stretched wide across the Ozarks. And every new disappearance only deepened their untouchable aura. The law did nothing, the community fell silent, and the ledger grew heavier with ghosts. By 1865, the Sullivan brothers were no longer just 2 men running a trading post. They had become something larger, something harder to define. Not bandits, not merchants, but architects of a hidden empire. And like all empires, theirs was built on blood, silence, and gold. The trading post was their stage, but the real power lay beneath it. Hidden under loose floorboards, Patrick kept notebooks more meticulous than anything you would find in a sheriff's office. Every traveler was entered like a specimen: name, origin, destination, appearance, the weight of their coin purse, even their temperament. Some entries were clinical, stripped of emotion. H. Zimmerman, German, traveling alone, estimated dust, $8,000. Others contained small details, notes on weakness. Nervous, drinks quickly, easily convinced. This was not random thievery. This was profiling, systematized. Patrick had turned murder into administration, death into mathematics. He was not guessing. He was selecting targets with a precision that would shame a military intelligence officer. And when the Sullivans chose a man, he rarely lived to see another dawn. But here's where their genius turned darker. They didn't work alone. They couldn't. 2 men cannot erase hundreds of travelers without allies. And so they built a network, a chain of accomplices, each link forged with coin, fear, or favor. There were the outlaws in the woods, the ones who staged the robberies along Devil's Backbone. To the outside world, these men were the killers, disposable scapegoats who did the dirty work, but those bandits never kept the lion's share. The gold flowed back to Hellhound Crossing, laundered through merchants who owed the brothers debts, converted into respectable currency by traders who looked the other way. Even ministers found their way into the web. They spoke from pulpits about the generosity of the Sullivan brothers, about their Christian charity, about their donations to the church. Their sermons washed blood from coin. And what community would dare accuse men so godly of the disappearances? To speak against the brothers was to speak against the very prosperity of the region. Because that was the final piece of the trap. The brothers' crimes didn't just enrich them, they enriched the towns around them. Blood money became schoolhouses. Stolen gold became storehouses, wagons, barns, and fences. Entire communities were indirectly lifted by the wealth of the vanished. And who would kill their golden geese by looking too closely? That is how corruption works at its highest level. It does not simply bribe the sheriff. It infects the entire economy until guilt becomes communal, until everyone benefits just enough to stay silent. The Sullivans understood this instinctively. They made their neighbors complicit without ever asking them to lift a blade. By 1866, they had become indispensable. Farmers came to them for supplies at fair prices. Town leaders praised them for employing local men. Mothers thanked them for funding the construction of a schoolhouse. When a prospector disappeared, it wasn't spoken of openly. It was written off as fate, as misfortune, as the chaos of a violent land. But beneath that silence, everyone knew. And still the ledger grew, name after name, life after life, written in neat Irish script beneath the floor. Each entry another life turned into fuel for the brothers' empire. You must understand something here. Evil rarely looks like a monster. It looks like a neighbor, a friend, a smiling merchant who shakes your hand at the market. The Sullivans were not hiding in caves, dripping blood from their teeth. They were standing in the open, their hands clean, while the forest floor was littered with bones. And when you see this, when you recognize how corruption wears the mask of respectability, you cannot help but ask, how many empires today are built the same way? How much of the prosperity you see around you is fed by disappearances you were never meant to notice? The Sullivan brothers did not invent the system, they only revealed it. Every empire of shadows eventually meets someone unwilling to stay silent. For the Sullivans, that reckoning began not with lawmen, not with outlaws, but with a grieving mother named Eleanor McGreedy. She was a widow from Illinois, her husband a Union officer killed at Shiloh. The war had left her with nothing but a small farm, a son to raise alone, and a will tempered by hardship. Her boy, Thomas, was 19 when he left to chase California gold, promising to return with enough to buy land, livestock, and a future. In March of 1866, he sent her a letter from San Francisco. He had done well, he wrote, and was traveling back through Missouri with $3,000 worth of dust and nuggets. He was eager to see her again. But May came, then June, then July, and no Thomas. At first, Eleanor told herself he had been delayed. The trails were long, the rivers unpredictable, the roads full of hazards. But as the weeks turned into months, dread calcified in her chest. She knew her boy. He had promised to come home. If he hadn't arrived, something had stopped him. Most women of the time would have lit candles, prayed, and waited. But Eleanor was not most women. During the war, she had helped Union intelligence officers catalog casualties and track missing soldiers. She knew how to keep records, how to interview witnesses, how to notice patterns. She was no stranger to the machinery of loss, and she would not let her son become another nameless absence. So she packed her belongings, strapped her determination to her back like armor, and rode into Missouri. By August, she had reached Springfield, carrying a photograph of Thomas and a notebook for her findings. She approached every tavern, boarding house, and trading post along his supposed route, asking the same careful questions. Had anyone seen him? Did anyone remember a polite, red-haired boy with a scar on his chin? She took notes on every reply, cross-checking them against one another, building a timeline with the precision of a military campaign. Again and again the trail pointed toward one place, the Sullivan trading post at Hellhound Crossing. When Eleanor finally arrived there in September, Patrick greeted her with warmth that would have disarmed a weaker spirit. His eyes shimmered with sympathy as he spoke of her son. Yes, he remembered him. A fine young man, reminded him of his own brother back in Ireland. He even produced a record. Thomas had arrived on April 15th, purchased supplies, and left heading northeast. Patrick insisted he had recommended the main road to Springfield, not the Devil's Backbone. He even produced a map with a route marked in his own hand. Shah stood by silently, his massive frame blocking the light from the doorway. His presence radiated intimidation, though he never said a word. Eleanor felt his stare heavy on her skin, like a warning. Patrick's performance was flawless. He showed concern. He spoke kindly. He even offered the names of other travelers who had supposedly been at the post that day, men who could confirm his story. To most people it would have seemed enough. But Eleanor carried with her the instincts of a woman who had studied deception during war. Something was off. The records were too neat, too ready, his tone too polished, as if rehearsed. And as she rode away from the trading post, she felt it, that chill in her bones, that primal certainty that she had just looked into the eyes of a man who knew exactly where her son's body lay. Most would have folded under the weight of the Sullivan brothers' performance. Most would have told themselves that Patrick's kindness was genuine, that Shah's silence was nothing more than shyness, but Eleanor was not most. She would return, she would dig deeper, and unlike the others who had asked questions, she would not stop until she had answers. What the Sullivans had built in the Ozarks was not just a trap for men with gold, it was a trap for truth itself. But Eleanor McGreedy was about to become the first crack in the silence. The ledger beneath the floorboards was growing heavy, and soon its weight would pull the brothers toward the abyss. Eleanor McGreedy returned to Springfield with Patrick Sullivan's words echoing in her mind. He had smiled, drawn maps, and spoken of her son as though he were family. Most women might have taken comfort in that kindness, accepted the story, and gone home with grief disguised as closure. But Eleanor had not crossed states, risking the dangers of the trail to be soothed by lies. That night, in her boarding house room above a tavern, she spread her notes across the wooden table. Names, dates, scraps of testimony scrawled in her careful hand. She compared each one, circling contradictions in charcoal. Patrick claimed Thomas had left northeast toward Springfield, yet 3 separate witnesses, a trapper, a farmer, and a pair of drovers, swore they'd seen a red-haired youth heading south from the post that same week. Each described the same thing. The boy was carrying new supplies, and he looked anxious. Eleanor underlined their words until the paper nearly tore. South, not northeast. Why would Patrick lie about direction unless he was covering something? The next inconsistency emerged when she studied Patrick's mention of other travelers. He had given her 3 names: William Bowers, a cattleman, Silas Green, a prospector, and Levi Clarkson, a horse trader. Eleanor wrote each down, then spent 2 days in Springfield's taverns and livery stables asking questions. Bowers was real, but he had never traveled through the Sullivan post. Silas Green existed too, but he had gone missing 6 months earlier, and Levi Clarkson, no one by that name had ever been known in the region. Patrick had fabricated witnesses. That realization hit her like a hammer. He hadn't just lied, he had built an alibi so intricate that most would have accepted it without question, but in constructing it, he had left fingerprints of deceit. On the 3rd night, Eleanor carried her notes to a lamplight. It's a parlor where a small circle of women gathered weekly to sew and share news. She asked carefully, never naming the Sullivans outright. Instead, she posed questions about travelers who had vanished, about rumors of trails that swallowed men whole. At first, the women whispered nervously, eyes darting to the door, but Eleanor pressed gently, offering her own grief as proof of sincerity. Slowly, stories spilled out. One woman recalled a cousin who vanished near Hellhound Crossing in 1863. Another spoke of a neighbor's son who had stopped at the Sullivan post and never returned. A third whispered that her husband had once seen Shah dragging a trunk-sized crate into the woods at night, though he had been too afraid to speak of it until long after. Eleanor wrote every word, her pen scratching like a blade across the paper. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Always the Sullivan post, always the devil's backbone, always silence afterward. And yet, each time she asked if anyone had taken these suspicions to Sheriff Dalton, the women's faces hardened with fear. The sheriff was no friend, they explained. He drank with Patrick. He hunted with Shah. To accuse the Sullivans was to invite ruin, or worse. That was the strongest thread of all. Fear itself. Fear that silenced widows, mothers, neighbors. Fear that gave the Sullivans their true power. But Eleanor McGreedy was different. She had lost her husband to war, her son to the shadows, and with them the luxury of fear. What could they take from her now that hadn't already been taken? Late that night, she closed her notebook and whispered into the lamplight, "They've hidden behind silence too long." Her voice shook, not from doubt, but from the enormity of what she was choosing. She was no longer just a grieving mother searching for closure. She was becoming something else, an investigator, a challenger, a threat to men who had built their empire on the assumption that no one would ever dare stand against them. The cracks had begun to show in the Sullivans' perfect facade, and Eleanor was ready to drive a wedge into those cracks until the whole rotten structure split apart. By the autumn of 1866, Eleanor McGreedy's notebook was thick with names, rumors, and fragments of testimony. The more she gathered, the more a chilling truth pressed in. The Sullivans were not just criminals. They were an institution woven into the very sinew of the Ozarks. Eleanor knew she couldn't take her suspicions straight to the sheriff, not when Sheriff Dalton was practically family to the brothers. Instead, she tried a subtler test. She visited Reverend Cole, the Baptist preacher whose sermons drew farmers from miles around. Eleanor respected him. He had buried soldiers and comforted widows during the war. She asked, in measured tones, whether he had heard anything unusual about travelers vanishing near Hellhound Crossing. The Reverend's hands, mottled with age, paused mid-gesture. For a moment something flickered across his face. Hesitation, fear. But when he spoke, his voice was smooth, rehearsed. Sister McGreedy, this land has always been dangerous. Wolves, bandits, outlaws, these are the wages of frontier life. We cannot go blaming good men for every misfortune. The Sullivan brothers have been generous to this church, and I will not have their names slandered without proof. Eleanor thanked him politely, but inside her stomach knotted. Proof. The word was a shield, but also a trap. She had testimony, patterns, contradictions, but not a single body, not a single piece of physical evidence. Without that, the Sullivans could hide behind their reputation and their donations, turning every accusation into gossip. Still, she pressed on. She shared her suspicions with a shopkeeper's wife in Springfield, an old family friend. Days later, the woman refused to answer her knocks. Another time, Eleanor spoke too freely in a tavern, only to notice a man at the bar, one of Shah's known associates, following her out into the street, his gaze heavy with threat until she ducked into a crowd. Each attempt taught her the same lesson. The brothers' web was everywhere. Preachers, shopkeepers, sheriffs, even gossiping women at sewing circles, all either in debt to the Sullivans, in awe of their power, or too frightened to speak. One evening, she tested their reach in a more direct way. She returned to the trading post, notebook hidden under her shawl, and asked Patrick whether anyone had ever reported finding bones or abandoned camps along Devil's Backbone. His expression never wavered. He poured her tea, his hands steady, his words honey smooth. "Ma'am, you grieve, and grief makes us see shadows where there are none. My brother and I run an honest post. If misfortune finds men on the trail, that is between them and God. But let me offer you this. Stay for supper. We'll pray together for your son's soul." The invitation was kind, but Eleanor felt the menace under it. Supper would mean staying after dark. Supper would mean trusting Shah's silent gaze at her back. She declined with a tight smile, then left quickly, her heart hammering all the way down the trail. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "They know I suspect. They will not act yet, not while I'm still asking gently. But if I press harder, they will try to silence me." For the first time since beginning her search, Eleanor understood the true scale of what she was facing. The Sullivans were not merely killers. They were a machine built to protect itself, with every cog, sheriff, preacher, outlaw, and neighbor, greased by gold or fear. Yet Eleanor also knew machines had weak points, and the more tightly wound they were, the more violently they broke when struck at the right place. She loosed her notebook, blew out her lamp, and whispered to herself in the dark, "If no one else will name them, I will, even if it kills me." The first frost of 1866 hardened the Missouri soil, but Eleanor McGreedy's resolve only sharpened. She had tested the local network and found it poisoned. The Sullivans' shadow stretched from taverns to pulpits, from farms to the sheriff's badge. To confront them directly was suicide. To whisper against them in Springfield was to risk waking with her throat cut. So she turned her gaze beyond the Ozarks. If the rot here was too deep, perhaps outside men, strangers with no debts or ties to the brothers, could see clearly what locals would not. Her first thought was the federal marshals, remnants of Union authority left scattered after the war. They were feared, sometimes hated, but less likely to be bought than county sheriffs. Eleanor remembered names from her husband's service days, men who had hunted deserters or tracked guerrilla fighters across these same hills. She began writing letters in careful, deliberate script, each one folded with notes copied from her ledger. Dates, names, routes, disappearances. She sent 3 letters in October. Weeks passed, and no reply came. Whether they had been intercepted on the road, or whether the recipients dismissed the ramblings of a grieving widow, she never learned. But silence can be as damning as denial. Undeterred, Eleanor sought another angle: the press. Traveling journalists occasionally passed through Springfield, chasing stories of Reconstruction, of bandits, of the strange half-law that ruled Missouri's backwoods. If she could place her notes into the hands of a man who thrived on scandal, perhaps the ink would spread faster than the brothers' bribes. She found such a man in November: Caleb Granger, a wiry reporter from St. Louis with ink-stained fingers and a permanent look of hunger in his eyes. He listened as she laid out her suspicions in a dimly lit boarding house parlor. At first, he seemed intrigued, then amused. "Disappearing prospectors," he muttered, jotting quick notes. "Irish traders with too much charm. Vanishing gold. Sounds like a dime novel." But as Eleanor revealed her ledger, her meticulous records of routes, last sightings, and false testimonies, Caleb's expression shifted. The hunger in his eyes darkened into something sharper, more calculating. "This," he said finally, tapping the notebook, "could be a story that breaks wide open. Bandits are one thing, but a conspiracy like this, ministers, sheriffs, honest folk all tangled in blood money, if even half of this is true, the public will devour it." Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, yet Caleb's next words chilled her. "But you must understand, Mrs. McGreedy, men like the Sullivans don't let stories like this get printed. You give me these notes, you might as well sign your own death warrant. Are you ready for that?" Her jaw tightened. "I buried my husband because of war. I may have buried my son because of those men. If my death buys truth, so be it." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then tucked one page from her ledger into his coat, just one, as if to test fate. "I'll see what can be done." He left Springfield 2 days later. Eleanor never saw him again. Some claimed he reached St. Louis safely but published nothing, silenced by editors who received quiet payments. Others whispered he was found face down in the Gasconade River, pockets turned out, his notes missing. Whatever the truth, no article appeared, and his name soon faded from the city papers. Eleanor added another line to her ledger: Granger, St. Louis reporter, missing or silenced, November 1866. She was not defeated, but she was sobered. The Sullivans' reach was longer than she had imagined, stretching into channels of law and ink alike. If even the written word could be strangled before it reached daylight, then she would need a different weapon. One that struck faster, harder, and closer to the bone. Winter settled over the Ozarks like a shroud, the woods skeletal and silent, the trails icy with treachery. The Sullivans thrived in such seasons. Travelers grew desperate for shelter, and desperation made them careless. But Eleanor McGreedy had grown colder still. She no longer thought like a grieving mother searching for answers. She thought like a hunter circling prey that believed itself untouchable. She had learned something vital in her failed attempts with the press and the marshals. The brothers' power depended on invisibility. They thrived in rumor, in silence, in vanished men who left no proof behind. What they could not afford was light, not the clean light of law or scripture, but the raw, merciless light of exposure in real time. So Eleanor devised a plan not of words, but of bait. If she could not draw proof from the brothers' mouths, perhaps she could force their hands. She began by creating a fiction, a traveler who did not exist. She borrowed the name of a distant cousin, Isaac Harland, a Union veteran supposedly returning east with $5,000 in gold dust. Using careful handwriting, she drafted letters, forged receipts, even left traces of this invented Isaac with friendly innkeepers along the route. The story spread like smoke. A man traveling alone, wealthy, naive, passing through the Ozarks on his way to Springfield. She wanted to see what the Sullivans would do with such a man dangling in their territory. Would they take the bait? Would their network whisper the name into bandit ears? Would Isaac Harland vanish along the devil's backbone as so many flesh and blood men had before him? But Eleanor knew she could not rely on whispers alone. She needed eyes. And so she took a step that revealed the steel in her spine. She hired watchers, not marshals, not preachers, but outcasts, deserters, drifters, and one or two half-starved men who had bound and cheated by the Sullivans themselves. She promised coin not in advance but upon results, swearing they would be paid if Isaac Harland's fate was traced. These men, living on scraps, agreed. Hunger is often the best contract. For weeks, Eleanor listened as the trap unfolded. She overheard Patrick at the trading post telling a merchant about a Harland fellow bound for Springfield. She heard Shah mutter Isaac's name in the company of known highwaymen. And then, the silence came. The fictional traveler spoken of by so many never appeared. Just as she expected, he had vanished into the woods. But this time, there was no grieving family to pacify, no letters to explain away. Eleanor had his story written in advance. She had receipts of his journey, fake but convincing. She had innkeepers swearing they'd met the man, and most importantly, she had her watchers. One returned pale and trembling, swearing he had seen men burying something at night along a ravine near the Backbone Trail. Another claimed to have glimpsed Shah himself leading 2 riders into the trees, though he dared not follow closer. Eleanor wrote it all down, her pen cutting into the paper. She had baited the trap and the machine had moved, and for the first time there was a crack. Not proof yet, not the kind that could stand in a courtroom, but a crack all the same. Her mind burned with possibility. If one false man could force their shadowy network into action, what might 10 false men do? What if she spread word of caravans that never arrived, fortunes that never existed, trails that turned into smoke? She could make the Sullivans chase ghosts until they revealed themselves. Yet as the fire of strategy filled her, a colder thought whispered beneath. They would soon realize someone was playing them. And when they did, the hunter and the hunted might exchange places in the dark. By January of 1867, snow pressed down on the Ozarks, muffling the world in white silence. The forests were skeletal, the roads half-frozen rivers of mud, and travel nearly ceased. It should have been a season of safety for Eleanor McGreedy, a lull in the storm, but instead she felt the first real shadow of danger pressing close. The reports came slowly at first, whispers carried by her hired watchers. One man returned breathless, swearing he had been followed through the pines by 2 riders he recognized as Sullivan associates. Another found his shack ransacked, his belongings scattered but nothing stolen. A warning, not a robbery. The message was clear. The Sullivans were stirring, suspicious, sniffing out a threat. Patrick Sullivan's genius was not only in charm, but in pattern. He had a mind like Eleanor's, attuned to inconsistencies, and lately too many inconsistencies had surfaced, too many travelers who left trails but no bodies, too many whispers of wealth that never reached the trading post. Patrick's ledger of faces and fortunes was too precise to tolerate such gaps. Someone was feeding illusions into his machine, and he meant to find out who. Shah, meanwhile, had grown restless, his temper sharper than winter wind. He had been seen at taverns in Springfield, drinking harder, muttering about ghost men and liars who thought they were clever. One witness swore he overheard Shah say, "If there's a spider weaving against us, we'll crush her in her web." The pronoun chilled Eleanor when the words reached her ears. Spider, her. Somehow, even without proof, they were circling her scent. She moved more carefully, visiting her few allies only by night, carrying her ledger hidden under floorboards instead of her shawl. But paranoia is a two-edged blade. It cuts the guilty and the innocent alike. More than once she startled at a knock on her door, convinced it was Shah with a pistol, only to find a neighbor delivering firewood. Still, she trusted no one. The walls themselves felt like ears. In February, the tension sharpened. A fire broke out in a Springfield boarding house, consuming 3 rooms. At first it was called an accident, a tipped lamp, but Eleanor knew better. One of her hired watchers had been staying there, the man who had seen Shah leading riders into the trees. His charred remains were found in the ashes, the official report calling him too drunk to save himself. Eleanor read the account with shaking hands, knowing it was no accident. The Sullivans had begun cleaning the board, yet with every act of intimidation, they confirmed her suspicions further. Why silence men if they were innocent? Why burn, threaten, follow if they were just traders running a post? Every move they made betrayed their desperation. They were not invulnerable titans. They were cornered predators, lashing out at shadows. But Eleanor also understood a darker truth. Predators were most dangerous when wounded. She was no longer simply investigating, she was at war. And wars demand sacrifice. So she doubled her trap. She began spreading not just stories of lone travelers, but of groups, caravans of wealthy men returning east, caravans that never existed, rumors of gold shipments, of prospectors carrying entire fortunes. Each lie forced the brothers to expend energy, to send riders, to tighten their net, and each time there was nothing. But for every ghost she created, the danger to her flesh grew sharper. Patrick's gaze lingered longer when she visited the trading post. Shah's silence thickened, heavy as a blade held just behind the curtain. She could feel the machine turning, gears grinding, searching for the hidden hand that had dared to toy with it. And in her heart, Eleanor knew it was only a matter of time before they struck directly. March of 1867 came with thawing earth and swollen rivers, a season of release, but for Eleanor McGreedy it felt like the tightening of a noose. The silence that had haunted her in winter broke, and with it came a new, more dangerous rhythm. The Sullivans had decided to stop circling. They were closing in. It began innocuously, almost politely. Patrick Sullivan himself arrived at her rented room in Springfield one afternoon, hat in hand, his Irish smile flashing as if he were no more than a merchant calling on a widow. Eleanor's stomach tightened the moment she opened the door. Patrick rarely left Hellhound Crossing without reason, and now here he was, standing in her threshold as though summoned by her darkest thoughts. "Mrs. McGreedy," he said warmly, "I was just passing through and thought it only neighborly to pay my respects. A woman alone in these parts. Well, one ought to have friends she can rely upon." Eleanor forced a smile, masking the tremor in her chest. She invited him in, though every instinct screamed not to. He stepped inside as if he owned the place, glancing casually at her table, her shelves, the papers stacked neatly in the corner. His eyes lingered on her writing desk for a heartbeat too long before sliding back to hers. They talked, or rather, Patrick talked, his words flowing like honey laced with arsenic. He spoke of the hardships of frontier life, the dangers of the trails, the loneliness of widows. He praised her strength, her persistence, her courage in searching for her son. And then, like a blade slipped between the ribs, he leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Sometimes," he murmured, "a woman's strength leads her places it ought not go, into shadows best left alone. Curiosity, after all, can be mistaken for accusation, and in this country, accusation can be a dangerous thing." The smile never left his lips, but the warning hung in the air like the stench of blood. Eleanor held his gaze, her pulse hammering in her ears. She willed her face to stay calm, her voice to stay steady. "I seek only truth, Mr. Sullivan, nothing more." Patrick's eyes gleamed with something colder than charm. "Truth," he said softly, "is a slippery thing. Sometimes it gets a man hanged. Sometimes it gets a woman buried." And with that, he rose, tipped his hat, and left, as though the entire visit had been no more than a polite neighborly call. But Eleanor knew better. The mask had slipped. This was not charm anymore. This was a threat, delivered with a smile sharp enough to cut. The next day another sign came. A dead crow nailed to her doorframe, wings spread wide, its black eyes staring into nothing. No note, no words, just a symbol as old as fear itself. Shah's handiwork, Eleanor guessed. Where Patrick dealt in silk words, Shah dealt in blunt reminders. The message was unmistakable: stop or be stopped. Her watchers began to vanish too. One fled town without notice, leaving behind only a torn scrap of paper. They know. Another was found beaten half dead on the outskirts of Springfield, so terrified he refused to speak Eleanor's name again. The network she had built was crumbling under pressure piece by piece. Yet even as fear clawed at her, Eleanor refused to yield. For the first time she felt herself standing not just as a grieving mother, but as something else, an adversary worthy of the Sullivans' attention. They had chosen to confront her, and in doing so had admitted what they never would with words. She was close enough to wound them, close enough that they feared her. She lit a candle that night and wrote in her ledger with a steady hand, "They have shown themselves. The mask is cracking. This is the moment to strike." But how does a lone widow strike against men whose roots run through law, church, and crime alike? Eleanor did not yet know, But she understood something the brothers had forgotten. Machines grind hardest before they break. By April 1867, the frost was gone and wagons once more rumbled over the trails. But Eleanor McGreedy's heart was colder than winter had ever been. Patrick's veiled threats, Shah's crow nailed to her door, the watchers beaten or vanished, all of it pressed on her chest like a stone. She knew the brothers were tightening their net. If she waited, they would strangle her quietly, one more widow lost to grief. So she decided to reach beyond their shadow. The Ozarks might belong to the Sullivans, but the whole of Missouri did not, nor the Union, nor the capital. Somewhere there must be men too far from their grasp to be bribed, men who might recognize a conspiracy when placed squarely in front of them. She began with Jefferson City. Packing her ledger beneath her clothes, she boarded a stagecoach under a false name, posing as a merchant's widow traveling east to settle accounts. The journey was perilous. She half expected to find Shah himself on the road, gun cocked, but she reached the capital unscathed. The city hummed with Reconstruction politics, men in black coats debating railroads, land grants, and the lingering scars of war. Eleanor, plain and grieving, seemed invisible among them, which suited her fine. She slipped into offices quietly, speaking to clerks, then to secretaries, and finally to one man who mattered, Elias Thurman, an aide to the governor himself. Thurman was young, sharp-eyed, and weary of local corruption. When Eleanor showed him her ledger, page after page of vanishings, the fake Isaac Harland, the silenced reporter, even the crow nailed to her door, his jaw tightened. "Good God," he muttered, "if half of this is true, it makes a mockery of the law." "It is all true," Eleanor said firmly. "And worse. The brothers' hands are everywhere. They use the church to sanctify their thefts, the sheriff to erase their tracks. Springfield whispers, their name in fear. If nothing is done, the state itself is complicit." Thurman leaned back, troubled. "You must understand. Men like these don't fall easily. The governor will not move without evidence that can withstand public scrutiny. Affidavits, witnesses, tangible proof of murder or theft. Otherwise it becomes rumor, and rumor is a weak weapon." Eleanor's hands trembled, but she forced her voice to remain strong. "Then I will find you proof. But swear to me, Mr. Thurman, if I bring you names and evidence, you will act." Thurman held her gaze, then nodded slowly. "I swear it. But until then, be careful. If these men are as dangerous as you say, they will not forgive what you've already done." Eleanor left Jefferson City with a fragile hope burning in her chest. At last she had touched something outside the brothers' circle, a line of power that led beyond the Ozarks. But hope carried its own weight. She would now need real evidence, not just clever bait or vanished names, and to get that, she would have to draw closer to the Sullivan brothers than ever before. Back in Springfield, the air seemed thicker, charged with suspicion. Patrick greeted her at the trading post with his usual honeyed smile, but she noticed the flicker of calculation in his eyes, as though he wondered where she had been. Shah was worse, silent, brooding, his stare a blade across the room. Eleanor understood then that her absence had not gone unnoticed. She wrote in her ledger that night, "I have reached beyond them, but to tear them down, I must step into their jaws. The next move must be bold." And so, against the advice of fear and reason alike, Eleanor resolved to seek not just whispers of their crimes, but the bones themselves. The buried proof that would turn rumor into law. The Devil's Backbone was not a place one visited lightly. Even by day, the ridge was a cruel spine of stone and tangled brush, its trails twisting like serpents, its gullies deep enough to swallow men whole. At night it was worse, a labyrinth of shadows where owls and coyotes called, and where travelers disappeared without leaving more than a broken wagon wheel behind. It was also, Eleanor McGreedy believed, the graveyard of the Sullivan brothers' secrets. If men vanished, they had to vanish somewhere. Gold dust and coin did not evaporate. Bodies left marks, shallow graves, bones, scraps of clothing, and though rumor and silence had buried truth for years, the earth itself might still hold its memory. So in May 1867, armed with nothing but a lantern, a spade, and her iron resolve, Eleanor rode to the Backbone under cover of darkness. She tethered her horse in a thicket, wrapped herself in a dark shawl, and began climbing the ridge. Each step cracked twigs like breaking bones. Each gust of wind whispered that she was not welcome. Her watchers had once reported a burial at night near a ravine off the main trail. That was where she turned first. The ground there sloped into a hollow, damp with spring runoff, the soil loose and uneven. Her lantern cast sickly light over patches of disturbed earth. Eleanor set down her spade and began to dig. The sound was muffled, swallowed by the trees, but to her it rang loud as church bells. Sweat slicked her brow, her hands blistered, yet she dug on, driven by fury and grief. An hour passed before her blade struck something hard. She froze, heart pounding, then scraped carefully until white bone glimmered beneath the dirt. A skull, cracked, teeth still clenched in a rictus. She dropped to her knees, the lantern's glow shivering over empty sockets. This was no phantom, no rumor. This was proof. Tears burned her eyes, but she wallowed them. She brushed further and uncovered scraps of cloth, a rusted buckle, the rotted outline of boots. A man, once alive, now reduced to silence. Eleanor whispered a prayer for him, though she did not know his name. Then she carefully noted every detail in her ledger, writing by lantern light, her script jagged with urgency. She found another grave nearby, and another. Each shallow, hurriedly dug, the work of men who cared only to hide their deeds, not to honor the dead. By the time her lantern oil burned low, she had recorded 5 separate burials. 5 men whose families had likely been told they wandered off, deserted, or never existed. The earth had kept their secret, but no longer. As she packed her tools, a noise cut through the night, a snap, sharp as a pistol crack. Eleanor froze. Lantern dark, breath shallow, she listened. Hoofbeats, faint but steady, somewhere down the ridge. Then a low voice, too distant to catch words but near enough to send ice through her veins. The brothers? Their riders? She dared not find out. She gathered her notes, shoved her spade under brush, and crept back to her horse. Each step felt like walking into a trap. The hoofbeats drew closer, then passed, then circled, as if hunting. Eleanor mounted in silence, pressing low to the horse's neck, and rode as though hell itself gave chase. Not until the lights of Springfield flickered in the distance did she dare breathe freely. That night, she hid her ledger beneath the floorboards once more, her hands shaking, but she had what she needed, not just rumor, not just whispers, but bones. "This is enough to hang them," she wrote, "if I can live long enough to bring it east." By June of 1867, the Ozark forests had gone green and dense again, shadows thick beneath the canopy. To most in Springfield, the season meant revival, crops sprouting, trade swelling, wagons once more rattling toward St. Louis. But to Eleanor McGreedy, the season brought only urgency. She had dug the earth at Devil's Backbone and uncovered what no rumor could deny. Bones. Proof enough to topple the Sullivans, if she could get it into the right hands. Every night she studied her ledger, refining her notes into an order even a suspicious governor's aide could not dismiss. She sketched the burial sites by lantern light, recording distances from ravines and trails. She pressed scraps of fabric she had recovered into the pages, careful to preserve them. Each line she wrote felt like a nail in the Sullivans' coffin. But she knew the brothers were watching. Patrick's charm at the trading post had grown brittle, his smile stretched thin like tallow on fire. Shah stalked the streets of Springfield in silence, his gaze sweeping crowds as though searching for a ghost. Eleanor avoided them when she could, but evasion was not safety. Too many times she felt eyes on her back when walking home at dusk. Too often she heard the sound of hooves trailing her path before fading into the trees. She decided at last. She would leave for Jefferson City. She would take her ledger, her sketches, her scraps, and place them in Elias Thurman's hands. With the capital stirred, even the Sullivans could not choke the truth. The problem was the road. To travel openly meant passing through territory the brothers controlled. Taverns where Shah's men drank, ferries whose pilots owed Patrick debts, trails where the backbone loomed like a silent sentinel. A single ambush could erase her ledger, and every secret she had uncovered. So she prepared carefully. She sold small items of jewelry and her husband's pocket watch to hire a discreet escort, not lawmen who might be bribed, but two black veterans who had fought with her husband's regiment during the war, men who knew loss, who knew ambush, and who hated men like the Sullivans with a fire born of scars. Their names were Hiram and Josiah, and when Eleanor explained what she carried, they agreed without hesitation. "Ma'am," Hiram said, setting a hand on his musket, "we've seen worse devils than these two. If they come at you, they'll find they ain't the only ones who can bury a man." Her heart steadied at their loyalty. Still, she knew escort alone would not save her. She packed in silence, hiding the ledger in a false-bottomed trunk, disguising her notes among folded linens. She carried only a small satchel in plain sight, filled with trivialities, a decoy should Shah's eyes fall upon her. The night before departure, Springfield seemed unnaturally still. She barely slept, every creak of the boarding house making her sit upright, clutching the small pistol she had taken to keeping by her side. At dawn she met Hiram and Josiah by the stable. Together they loaded their wagon and set out, the rising sun painting the hills in crimson light. But scarcely 10 miles out of town, as the road narrowed into a valley hemmed by thick timber, Eleanor felt the air change. Birds had gone silent. The wind carried no sound of insects. Hiram slowed the wagon, his musket across his knees. Josiah's eyes scanned the tree line. And then, from the shadows, a voice rang out, calm, cold, unmistakable. "Going somewhere, Mrs. McGreedy?" Patrick Sullivan stepped into the road, hat tipped low, smile glinting like a blade. Shah emerged behind him, broad-shouldered, silent, his hand resting on the butt of a revolver. The trap had been set. The brothers were done with whispers. The wagon halted. Dust hung in the morning air like smoke from a fire. Eleanor's pulse hammered so loudly she thought the brothers must hear it. Patrick tipped his hat back, his Irish lilt smooth, almost mocking. "Now, what could be so pressing, Mrs. McGreedy, that you'd sneak out without a farewell? Off to visit family, or perhaps to deliver something you shouldn't?" Hiram's musket shifted, steady as stone. "Step aside, Sullivan. Lady's got no business with you." Patrick's grin widened, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Ah, but you're mistaken, soldier. She's got every business with us. She's been stirring up questions, scratching at graves that should remain closed. That ledger she keeps so near. Dangerous little habit, that." Shah took a slow step forward, boots crunching gravel, revolver glinting in the sun. His silence spoke louder than words, a predator waiting for Patrick's signal. Josiah raised his rifle, voice low but steady. "Another step, and you won't take another." For a moment, the road seemed frozen. 4 men staring death in the eye, one woman clutching the satchel that held only decoys. The true prize lay hidden in the trunk, but the brothers didn't need proof. They only needed suspicion. Eleanor forced herself to speak, her voice steady though her chest burned. "Gentlemen, if you kill me here, the trail won't end. I've already sent word to men in Jefferson City. They know what I carry. They know your names." A lie. But lies, if told with conviction, can buy time. Patrick's smile faltered for the first time. He studied her face, weighing truth against bluff. Shah's grip on the revolver tightened. The forest around them seemed to breathe. Then Patrick laughed, cold, mirthless. "Ah, the widow has claws, but claws can't save you from teeth." He nodded to Shah. Before the giant could move, Hiram snapped his musket up and fired. The blast echoed through each the valley, sending crows shrieking into the sky. Shah staggered, not down, but wounded, rage twisting his features. He lifted his revolver, returning fire. The air erupted into chaos. Eleanor dove into the wagon as lead ripped through wood, her ears ringing, her hands clutched around the trunk that held everything. The brothers hadn't come to intimidate, they had come to erase her. And in that instant, Eleanor understood. She was no longer chasing justice. She was fighting for survival. Smoke clung to the valley like a shroud. Shah's revolver thundered again, splintering the wagon's sideboard inches from Eleanor's head. Hiram reloaded with calm fury, each motion honed by war, while Josiah fired from behind the wheel, his bullet grazing Patrick's coat and driving him to cover behind a fallen oak. The air was alive with echoes, each gunshot rolling through the hills like thunder. Eleanor pressed low in the wagon bed, arms wrapped around the trunk that carried her ledger, her sketches, the proof. She whispered a prayer, not for mercy, but for endurance. "Drive!" Josiah barked, seizing the reins. The wagon jolted forward, wheels biting dirt. Hiram fired a covering shot, the crack of musket smoke clouding the trail as they surged past the brothers. Shah's roar followed them, guttural, feral. A wounded predator denied his kill. Patrick's voice carried behind them, sharp as glass. "You can't run forever, widow. The hills belong to us." The wagon tore down the trail, rattling over roots and stones, every bump threatening to spill Eleanor and her trunk into the road. She clutched the wood so tightly her fingers bled against the splinters. Behind, gunfire still echoed, but the distance grew. Only when the valley opened into a wider stretch of road did Josiah slow, sweat cutting lines through the dirt on his face. "They'll regroup," he muttered. "Men like that don't quit easy." Hiram spat black powder residue into the dust. "Then we don't give 'em the chance. We keep moving. No camps, no taverns, no rest. Jefferson City or nothing." Eleanor sat up, chest heaving, the pistol still in her hand, though she had never fired it. The thought came to her with brutal clarity. She had stared into the eyes of men who fed on lives like wolves on lambs, and still she lived. Still, the ledger lived. But survival carried a price. She could not go back to Springfield. Would not return to her quiet life, to the illusion that law protected the innocent. The Sullivan brothers had burned that world to ash. She was in their war now, and only one side would walk away from it. The wagon wheels screamed against stone as Eleanor and her escorts pressed east, every mile bought with sweat and gunpowder. By nightfall, the forest no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a cage. Somewhere in the darkness, riders moved. She could feel them. The rhythm of hooves echoing faintly, vanishing, returning again, like a predator circling prey. Patrick's voice haunted her memory. "The hills belong to us." He hadn't been boasting. The Sullivans commanded men scattered across the Ozarks, drifters, deserters, petty thieves who owed their survival to the brothers' coin. And now, those shadows were closing ranks. At dawn, Hiram spotted smoke twisting above the ridgeline. A signal. Josiah cursed, snapping the reins harder. "They're running ahead of us, cutting us off." By midday, the road split at a narrow pass. The men halted, listening. From the east came a crow's caw, too sharp, too deliberate. A signal, not nature. Hiram's musket shifted toward the tree line, but the woods gave nothing back. Only silence. Eleanor's hand tightened on the trunk. She realized with a chill that the Sullivans weren't simply chasing them, they were herding them, steering them like cattle toward a slaughter pen. "We don't make Jefferson City," Josiah growled. "If we play their game, we cut south through the back trails." It was madness. The back trails were rough, unmarked, filled with ravines where a single mistake meant death. But Eleanor nodded. Better to trust the wilderness than the noose waiting on the main road. And so they turned, plunging into the unknown, with shadows following every hoofbeat. The back trails carved through wilderness so deep it swallowed sound. Branches whipped Eleanor's face as the wagon lurched over roots, the horses foaming, the men grim and silent. Every turn of the path felt like a heartbeat closer to doom. Then came the gunfire. A crack split the trees and Josiah's hat flew from his head. Another shot shattered the wagon's rear wheel. The cart slewed sideways, pitching Eleanor and the trunk into the dirt. Hiram shouted, musket blazing toward the tree line. Figures moved in the brush, dark shapes, rifles flashing. Not strangers. Patrick's men. The Sullivan network had found them. Patrick himself emerged, coat torn, face grim with fury. Shah stalked behind, arm bandaged from Hiram's earlier shot, but eyes burning with murderous resolve. End of the road. Patrick said, voice flat. "Ledger, widow, give it here and we'll make it quick." Eleanor rose, pistol shaking in her hand, but her voice steady. "You'll never have it. Even if you kill me, it outlives you." Patrick's laugh was hollow. "We own these hills. We own the law. Nothing outlives us." Before he could finish, Josiah's rifle cracked, striking one of the bandits square. Chaos erupted. Smoke, shouts, the thunder of hooves as horses reared. Shah charged like a bull, revolver spitting fire. Hiram met him head-on, musket empty, swinging the barrel like a club. In the melee, Eleanor clawed for the trunk, dragging it toward a ravine. Bullets tore the ground around her. She didn't care. If she couldn't carry the ledger to safety, she'd bury it where even the Sullivans couldn't find it. The forest became a battleground, echoing with the fury of men who would kill to keep their secrets, and one woman willing to die to expose them. The clash in the ravine was brutal and short. Hiram fell first, a bullet tearing through his chest, but not before he drove Shah to his knees with the shattered musket barrel. Josiah held the line, reloading under fire, each shot dropping another of Patrick's hired men. Eleanor dragged the trunk to the ravine's edge, heart pounding. Patrick saw her, rage twisting his face. He lunged, revolver raised, but Josiah's final bullet struck him square. Patrick stumbled, eyes wide, then toppled into the dirt, his gun clattering beside him. Shah roared, staggering up, blood pouring from his wound. He charged, monstrous even in his last breath. Eleanor raised her pistol and fired. The shot caught him square in the chest. The giant staggered once, twice, then collapsed beside his brother. The forest fell silent. The Sullivan reign, built on whispers and graves, ended in the mud of the Ozarks. Eleanor and Josiah buried Hiram with their hands, marking the grave with a crude cross. Then, with the ledger clutched to her chest, she rode for Jefferson City. By autumn, the truth burned through Missouri like wildfire. The Sullivan network exposed, the graves unearthed, officials shamed for their silence, and yet, even as justice was served, Eleanor knew the cost. Whole communities had thrived on that blood money. The rot ran deeper than two brothers. History buried their names, but not their lesson. Power thrives in shadow. Corruption wears the mask of respectability. And the greatest dangers are never the bandits in the woods, but the men who pour you a drink, offer you a map, and smile as they write your name in a ledger. The Sullivans are gone. The system that made them, it never left. And now you know.